Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Thread channel. Please consider subscribing and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Mahkota Tersembunyi. The air in the dilapidated studio was thick with the smell of dust and forgotten ambition. Here, Maya, a singer whose voice had once graced stadium stages, but now echoed only in the empty halls of her past glory, was trying to recapture a flicker of that old magic. Her career, a meteoric rise fueled by raw talent and a penchant for dramatic ballads, had stalled, leaving her adrift in the murky waters of musical obscurity. She carried the weight of past controversies and the relentless pressure of an industry that devours and discards talent with equal fervor. Across town, or perhaps just across the fragile line of fate, was Rizal, a former child actor who had navigated the treacherous waters of early fame only to find adulthood devoid of compelling roles. His face, once instantly recognizable, now sought anonymity in the shadows of theater workshops, clinging to the craft of acting with the desperation of a man trying to hold on to a rapidly receding memory. His inspiration, whispered through the echoes of classic cinema, demanded authenticity, something the commercial machine had long since purged from his life. Their paths converged unexpectedly during the production of a small independent film, Mahkota Tersembunyi, The Hidden Crown. The script itself was a labyrinth of metaphors about hidden identity and the price of fame, a subject both Maya and Rizal knew intimately, though from different sides of the spotlight. Maya, initially reluctant, saw in the role of the enigmatic muse a chance to sculpt something real, something that demanded vulnerability rather than the polished artifice the public demanded of her. She approached the character with the same intense dedication she once poured into writing her platinum-selling albums, digging into the emotional scars left by years under scrutiny. Her director, a known eccentric who favored method acting and prolonged silences, pushed her to the brink, forcing her to confront the silence that had replaced applause. Rizal, meanwhile, found in his role a struggling writer obsessed with uncovering a forgotten local legend, a mirror to his own search for meaning. He immersed himself in research, reading obscure historical texts, mirroring the dedication he once showed while studying classical theater techniques in London, before being lured back by lucrative, though artistically bankrupting, television roles. He admired the commitment Maya brought to the set, recognizing a shared understanding of performance as survival. As the filming progressed, the lines between the characters and the actors began to blur. The narrative of the film, which involved two figures slowly realizing they were chasing the same elusive truth, began to manifest in their interactions. There was a tension born not just of script requirements, but of two souls recognizing a shared, unspoken history of professional burnout. The climax of the story, shot on a windswept, forgotten stretch of coastline, required a deep emotional surrender from both leads. For Maya, it meant singing a raw, unadorned melody that spoke directly to her public failures. For Rizal, it involved a silent, agonizing confrontation with his past self. In that moment, under the unforgiving gaze of the camera, they found an unexpected camaraderie. It wasn't romance that bloomed, but a profound respect for the willingness to stand exposed, stripped bare of the protective layers that celebrity demands. When the final cut was assembled, the film wasn't the grand spectacle producers had hoped for. It was intimate, haunting, and deeply personal. It became a quiet testament to the idea that the most significant crowns, the ones of self-acceptance and genuine artistic expression, are often the ones worn in secret, away from the blinding flashbulbs, hidden in plain sight within the work itself. Both Maya and Rizal walked away not with box office records, but with the quiet satisfaction of having finally told a truth that mattered to them, a truth far more resonant than any manufactured blockbuster could offer. The initial friction between Maya and Rizal on set was palpable, a nervous energy that mirrored the film's themes of guarded identities. Maya, used to the adulation of massive crowds, initially bristled at the director's insistence on grueling takes where emotional resonance trumped technical perfection. Her training, largely derived from powerhouse vocal coaches who emphasized projection and control, was inadequate for the quiet, almost whispered devastation the script demanded. She remembered the early days, the raw, almost painful sincerity of her first live performances in smoky clubs, a sincerity she felt she had bartered away for stadium anthems designed to sweep crowds off their feet. This role felt like an excavation, digging through layers of platinum records and carefully managed public appearances to find the original, flawed voice. Rizal approached the script not just as an actor, but as a scholar of lost narratives. His immersion into the historical context of the film's local legend was obsessive, bordering on monastic. He saw the film set as a refuge from the soul-crushing monotony of commercial television, where he had spent years portraying charming but utterly hollow figures, roles he took to keep the lights on after his initial burst of childhood fame faded, leaving him financially vulnerable and creatively starved. He remembered the critical praise for his early stage work, particularly a demanding interpretation of a classical antihero, and he channeled that same intellectual rigor into deciphering the subtle motivations of his character, the writer who sacrifices everything for a fleeting moment of recognized genius. The shared workload began to forge an unspoken language between them. There were late nights reviewing scene blocking, fueled by lukewarm coffee, where Maya would dissect the lyrical structure of the emotional beats, applying musical phrasing to dialogue delivery. Rizal, drawing on his background in physical theater, would offer suggestions on posture and movement, noticing how Maya habitually shielded her left side, a subconscious defense mechanism against intrusive photography that had plagued her career. Their conversations weren't about celebrity gossip or industry maneuvering. They were about craft, about the anatomy of a lie told convincingly on screen versus the difficult reality of telling one's own truth. One afternoon, during a sequence requiring them to navigate a maze of decaying archives, Maya confessed, almost incidentally, that the most difficult part of fame wasn't the criticism, but the incessant need to appear happy, even when drowning. Rizal didn't offer platitudes. He simply nodded, recalling a particularly vicious tabloid piece written about his solitary demeanor following his last major film, which had labeled him unapproachable. He understood that vulnerability, once showcased, becomes public property, and their shared vulnerability on set was a carefully negotiated truce, a temporary safe zone against the outside world that relentlessly judged their past failures and future prospects. The intimacy built through this shared artistic struggle manifested subtly. It wasn't the fiery chemistry of cinematic pairings, but the quiet acknowledgement between two veterans who understood the specific exhaustion of having once touched the ceiling of popular success and then having to climb back up from the basement. When the director finally called cut, on their final, intensely demanding scene, the one where their characters finally understand the futility of their relentless chase, there was no burst of applause, just a deep, mutual exhale. They had created something honest, a piece of art forged in the crucible of their own professional near-extinctions. The hidden crown they uncovered wasn't gold or jewels, but the hard-won realization that true fulfillment lay in the process, not the fleeting validation of the public eye. The very atmosphere of the isolated coastal location, chosen for the final shoot, seemed to amplify their emotional states. The biting wind off the gray sea mirrored the sharp edges of the decisions Maya had made throughout her career. The relentless pursuit of commercial viability over artistic integrity. She remembered signing away rights, muting her more complex lyrical ideas for radio-friendly hooks, a series of compromises that now felt like slow betrayals of the young woman who first picked up a guitar with nothing but sincerity in her heart. Her costume for the climax, deliberately stark and unadorned, felt less like clothing and more like a second skin exposing raw nerves. Rizal felt a deep kinship with the character's obsessive quest within the film, recognizing the same fruitless energy he had expended chasing roles that diminished him. His early training had instilled a belief in the power of transformation, yet the industry demanded only replication of past successes. He'd excelled at embodying others precisely because embodying himself, the older, slightly tarnished former child star, felt too exposed. On that chilly beach, as he delivered a monologue about the corrosive nature of memory, he wasn't just reciting lines. He was cataloging the ghost roles he had accepted, the years spent performing happiness when he felt none. His meticulous preparation extended to his physical demeanor. He deliberately adopted a slight tremor in his hands, a subtle nod to the low-grade anxiety that fame had permanently etched into his nervous system. The shared silence after the crucial scene was profound. It wasn't the exhaustion of a physically demanding day. It was the deep quiet that follows the completion of a difficult confession. Maya looked at Rizal, and for the first time, she saw past the familiar face of a former teen idol to the disciplined, thoughtful craftsman underneath. She observed the precision in his pause before a difficult line, a technique she realized she had been mimicking unconsciously during their rehearsals, a borrowed rhythm from a fellow survivor. Their collaboration had inadvertently cured them of the isolation endemic to their profession. In Hollywood's ecosystem, success breeds suspicion, and failure breeds abandonment. Here, stripped of their respective entourages, Maya's publicist and Rizal's agent, they found a rare, clean space to simply be artists. The director, sensing the fragile authenticity they had unearthed, kept the crew minimal, creating a vacuum where the characters' truths could resonate without the intrusion of manufactured hype. When the final rap was called, the customary celebratory burst of energy was absent. Instead, there was a quiet sense of completion, not victory. They exchanged knowing looks that bypassed superficial pleasantries. Maya realized she no longer felt the urgent need to immediately formulate her next public statement or secure her next contract. The urgency had been replaced by a quiet, internal validation. Rizal felt a lightness he hadn't experienced since childhood, the relief of having finally honored the integrity of the performance, even if the film itself might never achieve mainstream saturation. The crown they uncovered wasn't a status symbol. It was the quiet authority to define their own worth, a treasure found not in the spotlight, but in the shared shadows of their artistic endeavor. The aftermath of the production brought the inevitable return to the cacophony of the real world, the sudden jarring re-entry into the machinery that consumes and markets authenticity. Maya's management team immediately began scrambling, interpreting the success of the Mahkota Tersembunyi festival screenings, where critics praised the film's raw emotional landscape, as a mandate for a swift, commercially viable comeback album. They pushed for the inevitable interviews, demanding she leverage the film's narrative of vulnerability for maximum engagement. Maya, however, found the old formulas suddenly abrasive. The thought of sitting under glaring lights, carefully curating anecdotes about artistic rebirth, felt like putting the protective armor back on, heavier and more suffocating than before. She spent weeks sequestered in her home studio, not writing anthems, but quietly scoring some of the film's quieter moments, finding solace in instrumental textures that required no explaining or defending. Rizal faced a different, yet equally insidious pressure. The buzz around his performance was significant. Industry veterans whispered about his return to form, contrasting it sharply with the tepid reception of his recent television work. Offers started trickling in. Prestige television dramas, where he would inevitably play the world-weary intellectual burdened by a tragic past, roles that offered gravitas but little creative stretch. He realized that the industry was willing to reward him for successfully mimicking the appearance of depth, but not for the actual messy labor of achieving it. He deliberately let the calls go to voicemail, spending his days instead at a small, dusty community theater, not acting, but coaching young performers on the essential discipline of listening, a skill he felt the contemporary industry had long since discarded in favor of grandstanding. Their communication became sporadic but meaningful, a digital lifeline tethering them to the shared reality of the film set. A brief message from Rizal might contain a quote from an obscure Anton Chekhov play, perfectly articulating Maya's current creative paralysis. A reply from Maya would often be a sound file, a few bars of haunting minor-key piano, that conveyed more about her internal landscape than pages of text ever could. This established connection served as a necessary anchor against the competing gravitational pulls of expectation. They understood that the success of Mahkota Tersembunyi was a localized event, a momentary alignment of souls, and that capitulating immediately to the external noise would effectively erase the very honesty they had fought so hard to capture on film. They were both guarding their hidden crown, realizing that its true value lay in its continued invisibility to the marketplace. The quiet understanding they shared proved to be a formidable defense, but the industry possessed an uncanny ability to locate and exploit any chink in the armor of artistic integrity. Maya's label, having seen the favorable festival reviews, deployed their most aggressive publicist, a woman known for turning minor personal setbacks into major comeback narratives. This publicist insisted Maya needed a high-profile event to signal her readiness, proposing a surprise guest appearance at a major music awards show, a venue Maya once dominated but now viewed with palpable dread. The manufactured excitement surrounding such events felt antithetical to the hard-won stillness she had achieved. She saw the proposal as a direct attempt to commodify her moment of quietude, to turn her internal excavation into easily digestible marketing copy. She countered by suggesting a live, unamplified performance in a small, acoustically perfect concert hall, emphasizing sonic purity over spectacle, a compromise her team viewed as professional suicide. Rizal's situation was complicated by the sudden availability of the type of role he had always dreamed of, a lead in a small, critically funded historical drama set overseas. It was an actor's challenge, demanding fluency in an unfamiliar dialect and months of historical immersion. Yet, accepting it meant disappearing from the immediate conversation surrounding Mahkota Tersembunyi, allowing the industry to categorize his performance as a flash in the pan rather than a genuine shift in trajectory. He wrestled with the familiar dichotomy, the lure of substantial, difficult work versus the safer, though soul-eroding path of immediate relevance back home. He spent days poring over scripts, recognizing the familiar trap, the role that promises depth, but ultimately serves only to polish a pre-existing narrative about the rediscovered talent. Their correspondence took on a sharper, more philosophical edge as they navigated these pressures. Rizal sent Maya a passage detailing the Socratic view on true knowledge being the recognition of one's own ignorance, essentially asking if her current hesitation was fear masquerading as discernment. Maya responded by sending him an aerial photograph of the filming location, the vast, indifferent ocean surrounding their small set, captioning it simply, "The boundary of control." It was their shared language, recognizing that the true performance now was not on camera or stage, but in maintaining the internal boundary between their authentic creative selves and the external demands for constant public justification of their worth. They were learning, slowly and painstakingly, that holding on to the hidden crown required more active defense now than ever before, turning their shared artistic experience into a silent pact against the pervasive noise of celebrity culture. The pressure cooker of expectation began to exert its inevitable force. Maya's label, frustrated by her resistance to the aggressively marketed comeback, escalated tactics. They leaked carefully curated snippets of her unreleased material, moody, atmospheric tracks that hinted at the depth they were trying to sell, but completely omitted the raw, unadorned vocals Rizal had helped her embrace. This tactic was designed to create artificial demand, forcing her hand before she could fully articulate her new artistic direction. Maya felt a burning sense of violation. Her private experiments were being weaponized into bait. She responded by withdrawing further, channeling the rage into composing complex, almost impenetrable musical structures that actively resisted easy consumption, using dissonance and extended silence as both weapon and shield against the simplicity the market craved. Rizal, conversely, found the very act of thoughtful deliberation being mistaken for crippling indecision. The producers of the prestigious overseas project, impressed by his commitment to researching obscure historical figures, began offering increased financial incentives, layering temptation upon genuine creative opportunity. He knew this role demanded sacrifice, a self-imposed exile from the immediate orbit of the recent film's success. During a tense video call with his agent, who kept referencing Maya's chart-topping peers, Rizal described the feeling of accepting a role purely for expediency. It's like trading the true compass for a well-made, beautiful map that leads nowhere important. He found himself constantly looking back at the desolate coastline where they filmed the climax, seeking the memory of that difficult, honest surrender as a measure against the ease of compromise. Their bond deepened in this shared resistance. Maya recognized that Rizal's quiet struggle against the gilded cage of typecasting mirrored her own fight against the golden handcuffs of her past hits. They began meeting covertly, not for interviews, but in neutral, unglamorous spaces, public libraries, rarely visited museum wings, where their recognition by the public was less likely or less intrusive. During one such meeting, surrounded by towering shelves of forgotten biographies, Rizal confessed a fear that had haunted him since childhood, the terror of being utterly forgotten, not just as a star, but as a viable artist capable of sustained contribution. Maya, surprisingly, found this vulnerability grounding. She admitted that her greatest fear wasn't failure, but the inverse, succeeding again in a way that felt fundamentally untrue, solidifying her status as a beautiful, expensive lie. They weren't just discussing career paths. They were performing a mutual act of psychological first aid, validating the difficulty of choosing integrity over applause. The hidden crown was proving to be less a reward and more a grueling responsibility, a continuous internal vetting process against the allure of the immediate and the easy. The confrontation with the industry machinery reached its apex when Maya's management secured a primetime television slot for her to address the rumors surrounding her new, deliberately obscure musical direction. The network envisioned a dramatic, tearful monologue culminating in the debut of a heavily produced, radio-ready single. Maya walked onto the set, felt the heat of the floodlights, and saw the practiced, sympathetic smiles of the host, and something inside her finally snapped. Not explosively, but with the quiet finality of a door being permanently locked. Instead of launching into the prepared script, she sat in silence for nearly a full minute, the producers off-camera visibly panicking, the audience holding its breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, the same unamplified tone she had practiced on the coast, and she spoke not of her music, but of the nature of performance itself, using metaphors drawn from Rizal's research into classical tragedy. The necessary mask, the inevitable tearing of the fabric. She didn't sing. She simply excused herself and walked off the set, leaving behind a massive void in the scheduled programming, an act of self-sabotage so complete it was breathtakingly honest. Rizal, having silently absorbed the news of Maya's unprecedented walkout, found the clarity he needed regarding his own path. Maya's public, unscripted refusal to participate in her own narrative gave him the courage to decline the lucrative historical drama. He saw that accepting the role would have been another form of excellent acting, playing the part of the serious artist, rather than being one. He called the overseas producers and politely declined, explaining that his commitment was to smaller, more immediate truths. Instead, he accepted a negligible role in a short film being directed by a former colleague from his struggling theater days, a project with no budget, no publicity plan, and a script focused entirely on a single, excruciatingly detailed conversation between two estranged brothers. It was a role that demanded absolute presence, forcing him to rely solely on the nuanced technical skills he had honed in obscurity, dismissing the temptation of the comeback narrative entirely. The fallout from Maya's television exit was immediate and severe. Her contract was suspended, and her reputation teetered on the brink of being completely written off as unstable. Yet, amidst the chaos, a strange form of liberation took hold. She finally felt unburdened by the need to manage perception. She began collaborating remotely with Rizal on that small, no-budget short. Her contribution wasn't a new song, but a soundscape, a haunting ambient recording of wind passing through a specific type of bamboo, meant to underscore the emotional subtext of their silent moments. It was art created purely for the art's sake, a collaborative sculpture existing outside the commercial expectation that had nearly destroyed them both. The hidden crown was now fully internalized. They had traded the external validation of the audience for the internal resonance of their shared commitment, finding their crowns not on a stage or screen, but in the disciplined silence between notes and lines. The radical choices made by both Maya and Rizal initiated a period of profound artistic incubation, far removed from the glare of the mainstream ecosystem that had previously defined them. Maya retreated, not just physically, but conceptually, into the world of pure sound design. She immersed herself in the technical intricacies of acoustics, treating frequencies and decay times with the same meticulous attention Rizal once applied to textual analysis. She viewed sound not as accompaniment, but as the emotional bedrock of narrative. Her studio became less a place for producing hits, and more a laboratory for experiencing sonic truth, experimenting with field recordings and binaural techniques that captured the almost imperceptible textures of reality, the subtle hum of old machinery, the sound of fabric shifting in a still room. This granular focus was a direct rejection of the maximalist, layered production she had once been famous for, suggesting that true power often resides in the things left unsaid, or in this case, unheard by the masses. Rizal, buried deep within the minimal setting of the small independent film, found a strange comfort in the lack of pressure. The set was rudimentary, the equipment basic, forcing the actors to rely entirely on presence and vocal economy. His character's lengthy, intimate dialogue with his brother became a masterclass in controlled restraint. He meticulously avoided the grand gestures that characterized his past television work, instead focusing on the minute physiological manifestations of guilt and regret, a barely perceptible tightening around the eyes, a slight hesitation before an important word. His director, who valued artistic poverty over corporate gloss, encouraged this austerity. Rizal realized that the thrill he once derived from a large opening weekend paled in comparison to the intense satisfaction of nailing a single, perfectly calibrated beat of silence within a scene, a moment that demanded nothing from the audience but their undivided attention. Their infrequent meetings now carried the weight of shared, unconventional success. When they finally previewed the raw footage of Rizal's short film, Maya was mesmerized not by his acting prowess, which she always respected, but by the palpable sense of quietude he commanded on screen. She saw that his dedication to authenticity had stripped away the residual artifice of fame, leaving something essential and resilient. In turn, Rizal listened to Maya's new soundscapes, which often contained no discernible melody, but evoked complex emotional states through subtle shifts in resonance and distortion. He understood these sonic canvases as the visual architecture of her inner life, finally rendered without compromise. The industry, predictably, struggled to categorize their trajectory. Maya was labeled an eccentric outlier, her music relegated to niche art house circles and experimental film festivals. Rizal's film, too small for commercial distribution, earned cult status among serious film students who dissected its deliberate pacing. They hadn't achieved fame, but something far more durable: artistic autonomy. The hidden crown wasn't a trophy to be displayed. It was the quiet internal agreement that they would only participate in projects that demanded their genuine selves, forever choosing the difficult, illuminated path of craft over the broad, well-paved road of celebrity maintenance. They were, finally, their own uncompromising patrons. The quiet autonomy they cultivated eventually began to ripple outwards, not as a tidal wave of commercial success, but as a subtle influence on the periphery of the industry they had once dominated. Maya's soundscapes, initially dismissed as esoteric noise, started finding their way into high-concept advertising campaigns and experimental theater productions. The spaces where true innovation often germinates before being sanitized for mass consumption. Her sonic palette, characterized by deep textures and the masterful use of negative space, became a subtle counterpoint to the overly loud, emotionally blunt music that saturated the mainstream charts. This slow, almost geological integration proved far more satisfying than any platinum certification. It suggested that she was shaping the language of art rather than just contributing another fleeting dialect. She discovered a deep satisfaction in knowing that the power of her work resided in its resistance to immediate understanding, forcing listeners to lean in, to actively seek the meaning woven into the silence. Rizal's trajectory, though even quieter, carried a similar weight of integrity. The small, conversation-driven short film gained unexpected traction in underground cinema circuits, lauded for its stark honesty in portraying complex male relationships, a subject often diluted by sentimentality in mainstream features. Aspiring young actors, tired of mimicking superficial gestures, began seeking Rizal out, not for coaching on how to become famous, but on how to disappear into a role, how to survive the psychological demands of sustained, authentic performance. He began conducting workshops in repurposed industrial spaces, emphasizing breath control and the ethical responsibility of inhabiting another person's truth. He found that the most rewarding aspect was mentoring those who understood that acting was a form of rigorous, often painful empathy, rather than mere self-promotion. One significant acknowledgement came unexpectedly in the form of an invitation, a prestigious, invitation-only retrospective dedicated to independent narrative cinema, where Mahkota Tersembunyi was finally being screened in a format worthy of its ambition. Both Maya and Rizal attended, not as celebrities seeking validation, but as observers of their past work. Watching the film again, years removed from the immediate struggle, allowed them to see the collaboration with fresh eyes. The shared moments of vulnerability between their characters felt less like acting and more like documented history. In the lobby afterward, surrounded by genuine admirers of genuine craft, they shared a moment of quiet communion. There was no need for grand declarations or promises of future projects. The understanding was complete. They had both successfully navigated the treacherous transition from being products of the industry to becoming stewards of their own creative inheritance. The crown remained hidden, not because they lacked the talent to wear it publicly, but because they recognized that the most valuable thing they possessed was the internal space they had fought to carve out for themselves, a space perpetually shielded from the relentless, hungry gaze of the spotlight. The retrospective screening served as a subtle, almost ceremonial bookend to their period of necessary exile. It was a validation granted not by sales figures or network ratings, but by the discerning gaze of their peers and the handful of critics who valued substance over spectacle. For Maya, seeing her raw vocal delivery from the film projected onto a massive screen, divorced from the manufactured sheen of her former music videos, felt like witnessing an exorcism. The power she had once tried to manufacture through pyrotechnics and massive arrangements was now evident in the sheer fragility of her sustained note, a testament to the fact that vulnerability, when earned, possesses its own undeniable volume. She noticed that the audience was leaning in during those moments, their collective focus a tangible, respectful presence, quite unlike the passive consumption of her stadium days. Rizal watched his own performance with a detached, almost clinical appreciation. He no longer saw the anxious child actor trying to prove himself, nor the desperate television performer seeking an easy paycheck. He saw the writer character's obsession, recognizing it as a pure artistic drive untainted by commercial anxiety. He noted the subtle physical choices that had emerged organically during filming, the almost imperceptible tremor that spoke volumes about internal conflict. The audience's reaction to his character's quiet moments of realization affirmed his belief that stillness, when intentional, carries more narrative weight than constant motion. He felt a deep, calm satisfaction. He had found a way to utilize the tools of his craft without surrendering the essence of his self to the performance's aftermath. In the quiet conversation that followed the screening, away from the main throng, they acknowledged the true legacy of their shared undertaking. They had not merely made a film, they had engineered a professional pivot point. Maya spoke about her upcoming collaborations, scoring immersive VR experiences and developing sound installations for galleries, projects where the audience interaction was designed to be deeply personal and non-linear, mirroring the hidden nature of the crown. Rizal mentioned that his next project involved adapting complex philosophical texts for audio dramas, another sphere where texture and nuance triumph over broad appeal. Their connection, refined over years of deliberate distance from the mainstream, had evolved into something rarer than friendship, a shared, unspoken philosophy of creative survival. They understood that the entertainment industry cycles relentlessly, consuming those who offer themselves too freely. Maya and Rizal, however, had learned to hoard their most valuable resource, their authentic engagement, and spend it only on projects that demanded the absolute best of their respective disciplines. The hidden crown remained securely in place, not because they avoided the world, but because they now dictated the terms of their visibility, choosing authenticity as the only currency worth trading. They left the event not to network, but to return to their demanding, quiet work, the shared silence between them being the loudest testament to their enduring, self-defined success. The air of mutual respect they cultivated now functioned as a subtle, yet impenetrable boundary against the clamor of the old world. Maya, fully embracing her role as a sonic architect rather than a conventional musician, began experimenting with biofeedback integration in her sound design. She sought to create auditory environments that responded subtly to the listener's actual physiological state, a concept so far removed from chart music that it became virtually immune to commercial appropriation. This required extensive collaboration with neuroscientists and technologists, fields that valued precision and verifiable results over ephemeral public sentiment. She viewed these new partnerships not as distractions from her musical past, but as extensions of the sincerity she had nearly extinguished in her pursuit of pop stardom. The platinum records gathering dust in storage were now eclipsed by the intricate schematics of acoustic modeling that filled her current workspaces. Rizal, meanwhile, found his audio drama work attracting the attention of academic institutions interested in the revival of purely voice-driven narrative forms. He was invited to guest lecture, not on acting technique in general, but specifically on the art of strategic silence, a direct homage to the lessons learned on the set of Mahkota Tersembunyi. His lectures were dense with technical detail, drawing on his memory of every nuanced pause he shared with Maya on that windswept coastline, showing students how absence of sound or action can be the most powerful dramatic choice. He felt that by deconstructing the very mechanisms of performance for educational purposes, he stripped them of their deceptive power, rendering them tools for truth rather than instruments of illusion. Their ongoing dialogue transformed further, shifting from career strategy to philosophical musing on the nature of legacy. Rizal often reflected on how fame creates a false past, a carefully edited biography that obscures the real struggles and learning curves. Maya agreed, noting that her early albums felt like the work of a stranger, someone she was obligated to maintain the persona of even years after abandoning that musical identity. They were engaged in the slow, deliberate work of curating their real legacy, one hidden project at a time, building an oeuvre legible only to those willing to engage deeply. One evening, while exchanging notes on a particularly challenging piece of audio engineering Maya was wrestling with, a sound meant to convey profound, unresolvable ambiguity, Rizal sent a simple reply. "The crown is not hidden, Maya. It is simply too heavy for those accustomed to wearing feathers." It was a perfect encapsulation of their journey, the realization that their dedication to the difficult truth was not a disadvantage, but a measure of an internal, self-imposed quality control. They had willingly stepped off the main stage, not in defeat, but to build a sanctuary where the act of creation itself was the ultimate, unmarketable reward. Their success was measured in the depth of their internal engagement, a silent, shared triumph over the ephemeral demands of the external world. The ongoing commitment to this self-imposed obscurity began to redefine their very sense of self, moving beyond professional resistance into a deeper existential realignment. Maya found that the constant pursuit of sonic texture over melodic catchiness had fundamentally altered her perception of beauty. She started noticing the hidden symphonies in everyday mechanical failures, the grating squeal of an old elevator pulley, the perfectly timed hiss of a failing tire, and found a profound, objective beauty in these unpolished sounds that far surpassed the calculated perfection of studio-mastered pop hooks. Her body seemed to relax into this newfound honesty. The habitual tenseness in her shoulders, a souvenir from years spent holding breathlessly perfect notes for impossible live recordings, finally began to release its grip. She felt, for the first time, acoustically transparent. Rizal, likewise, shed the performative restlessness that had plagued him. In the quiet of his academic appearances and small productions, the need to perpetually appear engaged, a core requirement of commercial television, vanished. He started moving with a deliberate economy of motion, every gesture serving a clear, narrative purpose, mirroring the precision he demanded in his audio dramas. During a particularly intimate Q&A session following a screening, an audience member, a young aspiring writer, asked him directly how he managed to find such profound emotional stillness on screen. Rizal didn't launch into a rehearsed anecdote about method acting. Instead, he looked at the young man, his gaze steady and calm, and simply said, "I learned to trust the silence more than my own ego. The ego always wants to fill the gap." This unadorned wisdom, delivered without the veneer of celebrity polish, resonated powerfully, forging immediate trust with the next generation of serious artists. Their collaborative process, now entirely focused on non-commercial endeavors, became incredibly streamlined. Maya would send Rizal complex sound files, a recording of deep-sea thermal vents layered with spoken word fragments in dead languages, and Rizal would integrate them into his narratives, not as background score, but as environmental dialogue, treating the sound as a character in its own right. They were co-creating a new artistic language that operated entirely outside the established framework of reviews, box office returns, or streaming metrics. It was a world built for two, fortified by shared discipline. The final proof of their divergence from the mainstream came when a major streaming platform, desperate to capitalize on the lingering critical prestige of Mahkota Tersembunyi, approached Maya with an offer to score a limited-run historical epic. The contract was astronomical, promising creative control over a vast sonic canvas. Maya read the proposal, noting the extensive writer for orchestral support and the requirement for uplifting thematic crescendos. She forwarded the entire contract to Rizal, appending only a single word: feathers. Rizal replied an hour later with a detailed analysis of the narrative flaws in the proposed series, concluding, "The scaffolding is beautiful, but the foundation is hollow. Let them build their own cathedral." They had reached a point of artistic singularity where the temptation of massive visibility no longer even registered as a threat. Their hidden crown was no longer about resisting fame. It was about having irrevocably outgrown the need for it, finding endless creative sustenance in the difficult private work of genuine contribution. The narrative tapestry woven in Mahkota Tersembunyi unfolds with a deliberate, almost hypnotic slowness, drawing the viewer into a world where the mundane perpetually brushes against the extraordinary. It is a film that relies heavily on atmosphere, utilizing deep shadows and an almost suffocating sense of isolation to externalize the internal turmoil of its central figures. The direction clearly favors suggestion over explicit exposition, leaving vast expanses for the audience to navigate through implication and visual metaphor. Central to the film's thematic weight is the performance of its lead actor, whose prior work often showcased a remarkable aptitude for portraying characters grappling with profound moral ambiguity. We see echoes of his earlier, more restrained roles here, yet infused with a new layer of desperation. His character arc is less about explosive transformation and more about a gradual, almost imperceptible erosion of certainty. The subtle tightening around the eyes, the almost involuntary flinches when confronted with unexpected stimuli, all speak to a deeply internalized conflict that serves as the film's emotional anchor. This actor, known for meticulous preparation and a deep study of psychological underpinnings, brings a lived-in quality to the role, making the fantastic elements feel disturbingly plausible within the established reality. The film's inspiration seems to pull from several distinct pools. There's a noticeable nod to classic folk horror, particularly in the way the environment itself acts as an antagonist. The oppressive jungle, the near-silent native community, and the pervasive sense of being observed. However, this archaic setting is juxtaposed strikingly with moments of technological intrusion, subtle hints suggesting a modern, perhaps corporate or governmental, surveillance apparatus lurking just outside the frame. This duality, ancient secrecy versus modern intrusion, creates a persistent, low-level anxiety that underpins every scene. The supporting cast, particularly the actress portraying the enigmatic local guide, offers a masterclass in nonverbal communication. Her character, steeped in the traditions and superstitions of her people, acts as the necessary foil to the protagonist's encroaching skepticism. Her career trajectory, often marked by roles that bridge cultural divides or act as mystical intermediaries in South Asian cinema, informs her performance here, lending an undeniable gravity to her pronouncements. She isn't merely delivering plot points. She embodies the very spirit of the place the protagonist is trying to decipher or conquer. Visually, the cinematography is breathtaking, yet deliberately unsettling. The color palette leans heavily towards deep greens, muddy browns, and sudden, stark bursts of artificial light, mimicking the feeling of a fever dream recorded on outdated film stock. The camera work often employs long takes, forcing the viewer to remain within the tension of a moment, rather than offering quick edits for relief. This deliberate pacing, while occasionally testing the patience of the modern viewer accustomed to rapid narrative gratification, is crucial to building the film's pervasive mood of creeping dread. It mirrors the protagonist's own forced acclimatization to a world where time operates differently. Furthermore, the film's exploration of the hidden crown, the central mystery object or concept, is handled with intellectual rigor. It avoids easy answers, presenting instead a philosophical quandary about the nature of power, inheritance, and authenticity. Is the crown a literal artifact, a metaphor for inherited trauma, or simply a manifestation of the protagonist's deteriorating mental state? The screenplay, while sparse in dialogue, demands active interpretation. The lack of definitive resolution is not a weakness, but the film's ultimate strength, ensuring that the atmosphere and the characters' unresolved fates linger long after the credits have faded. The echoes of obscure anthropological texts and forgotten myths seem to inform the screenwriting, suggesting the creators aimed for something far beyond simple genre thrills. The emotional temperature of Mahkota Tersembunyi rarely rises above a low simmer, a testament to the director's unflinching commitment to sustained psychological pressure. The protagonist, initially presenting as a detached academic, or perhaps an explorer driven by hubris, gradually sheds these protective layers, revealing a core of profound vulnerability. His movements become less precise, his focus increasingly fractured. There is a palpable sense that the environment is not just observed by him, but is actively observing and dismantling him piece by piece. This internalized battle is frequently externalized through subtle sound design, the constant, almost imperceptible hum of unseen insects, the amplified sound of his own breathing in moments of supposed stillness, creating an aural landscape that mirrors a nervous system under extreme duress. The dynamic between the lead actor and the actress playing the guide deepens the central conflict. Where the protagonist seeks to document, categorize, and control the narrative, the guide operates from a position of inherent, intuitive knowledge. Her stillness is not passive. It is the stillness of deep water that conceals powerful currents. We sense the weight of generations of cultural memory in her guarded expressions. Her face, often half hidden in shadow by the natural architecture or low-hanging lamps, becomes a canvas onto which the protagonist projects his own fears of the unknown, forcing him into a position where he must confront not only the physical reality of the locale, but also the limits of his own empirical worldview. The contrast in their modes of existence, one seeking to extract meaning, the other inherently embodying it, drives the film's philosophical engine. Consider the sequence involving the dilapidated structure deep within the jungle. The scene composition here is masterful, utilizing leading lines created by overgrown vines and decaying architecture to pull the eye inexorably toward the center, where the light source is weakest. The actor's decision to enter this space, a clear violation of unspoken warnings, stems from a desperate need for confirmation. Any tangible proof, however terrifying, to anchor his spiraling reality. His previous roles, often involving meticulous reconstruction of historical puzzles, seem to inform this moment of reckless dedication. He risks personal dissolution for the sake of understanding, a classic tragic flaw magnified by the oppressive setting. The film subtly employs the theme of misinterpretation. Much of the perceived horror might simply be the result of cultural dissonance, filtered through a lens of external intrusion. The guide might be offering straightforward warnings, misinterpreted by the protagonist as cryptic threats, due to his inherent bias toward viewing the unfamiliar as dangerous. This intentional ambiguity forces the viewer to constantly reassess who the true agent of danger is: the environment, the unseen modern forces implied, or the protagonist's own increasingly unreliable perception. The lingering feeling post-viewing is less one of relief and more one of shared disorientation, suggesting that the true hidden crown might be the elusive, ungraspable nature of absolute truth itself. The film avoids the Hollywood compulsion to sanitize ambiguity, instead embracing the unsettling void left by unanswered questions. The film's true emotional core resides in the protagonist's slow surrender to paranoia, a transformation meticulously charted by the lead actor's commitment to internalizing the narrative's psychological erosion. His initial scenes are characterized by a rigid posture, an almost brittle intellectual armor meant to deflect the humid, chaotic energy of the jungle. Yet, as the narrative progresses, this rigidity melts into a kind of weary pliability. We see moments where he attempts to assert control through routine, checking equipment, meticulously logging observations, but these acts become increasingly desperate, small rituals against a vast, indifferent power. This character's background, often associated with highly controlled, cerebral roles in his earlier career, makes his descent into instinctual fear all the more impactful. He is a man whose primary weapon, his intellect, is being systematically turned against him by the very reality he seeks to master. The emotional exchange, or lack thereof, between the two central figures further heightens the tension. The guide remains a figure of stoic, almost priestly observance. Her lack of overt reaction is not apathy, it functions as a profound emotional shield. When she finally offers a moment of direct personal concern, perhaps a shared glance over a low fire, or a gesture toward a shared meal, it feels momentous precisely because it is so rare. For the protagonist, these brief moments of connection are instantly suspect, immediately filtered through his suspicion. Is this empathy, or is it manipulation designed to lure him further off course? This dynamic suggests that the film is deeply interested in how trauma and difference impede genuine human intimacy under duress. The sound design, which operates nearly as another main character, amplifies these emotional states brilliantly. When the protagonist is alone and most afraid, the jungle recedes into an unnatural silence, a vacuum of sound that suggests a world holding its breath, waiting for him to break. Conversely, when he is wrestling with an idea or a perceived threat, the auditory environment rushes back in. The rustle of leaves sounds like footsteps. The distant cry of an animal sounds like a warning directed specifically at him. This manipulation of the sonic field reflects the protagonist's own fractured psyche, where external stimuli are instantly processed as personal affronts or omens. The visual language supports this emotional disintegration through its treatment of space. Interiors are consistently cramped, whether they are makeshift tents or the claustrophobic confines of ancient ruins. Light sources are always inadequate, casting deep, unreliable shadows that refuse to define reality clearly. This forces the actors to play within pools of light, relying on momentary illumination to reveal or conceal their true intentions. The lead actor excels in these low-light scenarios, using minimal facial movement to convey maximum terror, a skill honed in his past roles that often required conveying deep reservoirs of feeling beneath a veneer of professional detachment. In Mahkota Tersembunyi, however, that veneer is paper-thin, allowing the viewer an intimate, if uncomfortable, view into the machinery of a mind, unraveling under the weight of the unseen and the unproven. The film doesn't seek to resolve his fate. It simply documents the process of his undoing, framing it as an inevitable consequence of seeking absolute knowledge in a fundamentally mysterious world. The pervasive sense of isolation woven into the film's fabric extends beyond the physical setting and into the realm of historical memory and narrative ownership. The mystery surrounding the hidden crown is less about a tangible object and more about which story gets told and by whom. The protagonist, arriving with his established methodology and colonial-era assumptions of discovery, inherently seeks to impose a Western, catalogable narrative onto the landscape and its people. This attempt at inscription often clashes violently with the deeply ingrained oral traditions embodied by the guide. Her silence, when interpreted, is an act of resistance against the very documentation the protagonist values. The film subtly critiques the colonial impulse in exploration, where the desire to possess knowledge often supersedes the need to respect context. This dynamic is mirrored in the film's handling of flashbacks or suggested backstory elements concerning the crown. These glimpses are always fragmented, seen through distorted lenses or obscured by foliage, suggesting that accessing the true history of this place requires shedding the tools of modern inquiry. The career trajectory of the actress playing the guide often involves portraying characters who are guardians of ancestral wisdom, and here she embodies that responsibility with quiet ferocity. Her gaze, often directed just past the protagonist into the dense undergrowth, seems to encompass centuries of unwritten history that the outsider can never truly penetrate. The film's pacing, though slow, is punctuated by moments of sudden, jarring intrusion that serve to remind the audience of the external threats that might exist outside the immediate psychological bubble. A distant sound, perhaps the whir of a drone, the faint echo of an unfamiliar engine, briefly cuts through the natural symphony. These moments are never explained, functioning purely as narrative needles to prick the viewer's concentration, implying that the conflict isn't solely between man and nature, but also between secrecy and encroaching modernization that seeks to commodify or destroy that secrecy. The protagonist, obsessed with the local mystery, often fails to register these external signals until it is nearly too late, reinforcing the film's commentary on selective perception driven by obsession. The true horror of Mahkota Tersembunyi is perhaps not the supernatural element, but the realization that one can be so consumed by a personal quest that they become blind to the actual mechanisms of control operating around them. The film's commitment to ambiguity is most keenly felt in the depiction of the indigenous community surrounding the central location. They are rendered not as monolithic props for the protagonist's journey, but as a fluid, observing entity whose motivations remain perpetually opaque. Their appearances are brief, a glimpse of woven fabric disappearing around a bend, a gathering in the periphery of the camp, eyes watching from the jungle's edge. Yet their collective presence exerts a gravitational pull on the film's tension. The decision to keep their dialogue minimal, often untranslated or heavily stylized, denies the audience the comfort of easy categorization. We cannot categorize them as allies, enemies, or simple mystical figures. They exist outside the protagonist's need for definition. This deliberate obfuscation forces the lead actor to carry an immense burden of emotional interpretation. When he attempts tentative communication, perhaps offering a gift or asking a direct question, the lack of expected response is devastating. His frustration manifests not in shouting matches, but in a deepening of his already anxious micro-expressions. There is a sequence where he reviews his own audio recordings, attempting to decipher a seemingly innocuous phrase spoken by one of the villagers, only to find his own frantic attempts at analysis render the sound unrecognizable. This mirrors the actor's established strength in portraying experts whose own specialized knowledge becomes a barrier to understanding fundamental human truths. Here, his reliance on data collection becomes the very thing that isolates him from the reality he is recording. The environment itself participates in this emotional isolation. The use of natural light is crucial. Scenes transition from the blinding glare of midday, which exposes every bead of sweat and every flaw in the protagonist's gear, to the deep, impenetrable darkness of night, where vision becomes useless and reliance shifts entirely to sound and touch. This constant oscillation between overexposure and total darkness creates a visual metaphor for the protagonist's mental state. Moments of supposed clarity are quickly swallowed by overwhelming uncertainty. The design team, drawing inspiration from expedition photography of the early 20th century, employs muted colors for the protagonist's possessions: khaki, faded blue, contrasting sharply with the vibrant, almost violently saturated greens and reds of the jungle, symbolizing the intrusion of the structured, analytical world into a place that operates on an entirely different chromatic and moral system. The film suggests that the crown remains hidden, not because it is protected by magic, but because the seeker has brought the wrong eyes to look for it. The emotional resonance of Mahkota Tersembunyi finds its ultimate expression not in climaxes of action, but in sustained moments of quiet existential dread, often centered around the protagonist's deteriorating relationship with his own tools. His technological dependence, satellite phones, GPS trackers, high-definition cameras, initially serves as his shield against the wilderness, yet increasingly these devices begin to malfunction or betray him. The static on the radio becomes eloquent. The blank screen of a GPS unit offers a more profound statement about his location than any mapped coordinates ever could. This technological betrayal aligns perfectly with the actor's past roles, where authority figures or men of science were were ultimately humbled by forces beyond their formulas. Here, the jungle acts as a natural EMP for his ego. The actress portraying the guide subtly utilizes the protagonist's reliance on technology against him. There are instances where she appears utterly unconcerned by events that send the protagonist into a panic. A sudden drop in temperature, a strangely patterned shadow, and yet her behavior shifts dramatically when a piece of his equipment fails. This suggests she understands that the fragility of his external support systems is the key to accessing his true, unguarded self. Her subtle manipulations are rooted in the wisdom of necessity, contrasting sharply with the protagonist's deliberate, academic pursuit of power. Her costume choices, natural fibers, earthy tones, further visually emphasize her imperviousness to the environmental chaos that renders his synthetic gear useless. The psychological impact is magnified by the film's spatial presentation of danger. When threat is imminent, the frame often restricts the characters to extremely tight compositions, typically within the confines of a dilapidated hut or the tight clearing of their camp. This visual claustrophobia mirrors the protagonist's shrinking world. The vast jungle has ceased to be an expanse of opportunity and has become a closing container. The contrast with the earlier scenes, filmed with expansive wide shots emphasizing the jungle's overwhelming scale, underscores the shift from fear of being lost to fear of being trapped. Ultimately, the film operates as a devastating meditation on the arrogance of external documentation. The hidden crown functions as a symbol for any truth that resists easy capture by an outsider. The protagonist's failure is fundamentally an emotional one. He is too invested in proving the existence of something to allow himself to simply experience it. The final lingering shots, often focusing on the texture of the damp earth or the impenetrable canopy, suggest that the natural world has simply absorbed his intrusion without acknowledgement, leaving behind only the ghost of his ambition. The film doesn't end with a bang, but with the profound, suffocating silence of a question that has been deliberately left unanswered. The true weight of the film settles in its final third, where the distinction between internal hallucination and external reality dissolves entirely, leaving the viewer adrift alongside the protagonist. His once sharp features now seem softened, slackened by exhaustion and the constant humidity, suggesting a physical manifestation of his mental fatigue. The actor, who built his early career on portraying characters maintaining rigid control under immense pressure, think of his notable role in that tense political thriller where he never once raised his voice, now finds himself unable to maintain even basic motor functions with ease. The simple act of walking becomes a Herculean effort, each step a negotiation with the uneven, deceptive ground. The guide's role evolves during this phase from silent observer to perhaps even an unwitting catalyst for his final break. She never explicitly accuses him or mocks his unraveling. Instead, she interacts with him as one might treat a feverish child, with gentle accommodation mixed with an unyielding adherence to her own reality. When she speaks more frequently in these late scenes, her language is less metaphorical and more pragmatic, detailing necessary survival steps that the protagonist is now too consumed by his personal obsession to heed. This shift in dialogue serves to brutally isolate him further, as the one person who could ground him is speaking a language of survival he no longer understands. The recurring motif of reflections, in still pools of water, in the sheen of polished leaves, in the glass of his defunct equipment, becomes a critical visual device. These reflections are rarely clear. They are always fractured, rippled, or obscured by algae, offering distorted glimpses of the protagonist. He seems unable to recognize the haggard figure staring back, suggesting a complete severance from his former identity as a rational investigator. The cinematographer utilizes deep focus sparingly in these moments, preferring shallow depth of field to force the viewer's attention onto the immediate, terrifying texture of the foreground. A piece of rotting wood, a struggling insect, mirroring the protagonist's narrowed, survival-focused perception. The inspiration drawn from psychological thrillers that deal with isolation is evident, but Mahkota Tersembunyi elevates this by anchoring the psychological decay not in a confined space, like a prison or an isolated house, but within the infinite, indifferent expanse of the living jungle. The film implies that true imprisonment is intellectual, the inability to abandon one's established framework of understanding. The crown is never found because the protagonist's desperate need to define and claim it prevents him from seeing the holistic, unclaimable nature of the environment. The audience leaves with the lingering, uncomfortable sensation that the real discovery was not what the protagonist sought, but the realization of his own profound inadequacy in the face of ancient mystery. The film's ultimate commentary rests on the failure of interpretation when faced with sheer, unyielding difference. The protagonist's career, built upon deciphering legible signs, ancient texts, historical documents, known behavioral patterns, is rendered obsolete by a landscape that communicates through feeling and presence, rather than propositional statements. His professional history, perhaps involving high-stakes negotiations or the translation of complex diplomatic codes, equipped him for structured conflict, but left him defenseless against the amorphous threat of environmental and spiritual ambiguity. He attempts to apply the methodology of conquest to a space that demands humility, and the environment responds by dissolving his very sense of self. The guide's continued stoicism acts as a powerful indictment of his frantic energy. Her occasional, almost accidental physical contact, guiding him away from a hidden route, steadying him after a fall, is delivered with the non-judgmental efficiency of a natural caretaker tending to a sick animal. This emotional detachment, often mistaken for coldness by the protagonist, is actually a profound form of respect for the natural order he is disrupting. The actress's sparse filmography, usually reserved for roles demanding immense internal strength without external display, gives her performance an authenticity that anchors the film's more esoteric leanings. She is the embodiment of the knowledge that does not need to announce itself. A final striking element is the deliberate misdirection in the film's use of time. Events that should logically take hours are sometimes covered in single, lingering takes, while moments of intense internal reckoning are stretched across perceived eternities punctuated only by the slow drip of condensation. This temporal manipulation creates a subjective reality that mirrors the protagonist's disorientation. The audience experiences the jungle's time, a time measured by decay, growth, and the cyclical movement of the sun, rather than the linear, measurable time dictated by his failing watch. This narrative choice suggests that the only way to approach the mystery of the hidden crown is to discard the very concept of a structured timeline, something the protagonist is pathologically incapable of doing until it is too late. The lingering impression is that the film is not about what was found, but about the painful, necessary process of letting go of the need to find anything at all. The final sequences of Mahkota Tersembunyi lean heavily into abstraction, moving beyond mere psychological thriller territory into a realm closer to allegorical tragedy. The protagonist's physical deterioration mirrors the breakdown of cinematic language used to depict him. Camera focus softens, the edges of objects bleed into one another, and the sound mix often distorts, favoring low-frequency rumbles over discernible jungle noises. This suggests that his internal landscape has fully merged with the external one. The jungle is no longer a place he is visiting, but the very architecture of his final state of mind. This mirrors the trajectory of certain experimental filmmakers whose careers involved radical shifts towards subjective reality, prioritizing emotional texture over narrative fidelity. The guide's last significant action is crucial. She does not abandon him, nor does she attempt a dramatic rescue. Instead, she performs a simple, almost ritualistic act, perhaps placing a small, recognizable object from his abandoned kit onto a stone, or simply turning away while he is distracted by his internal visions. This gesture signifies the end of her responsibility toward his quest. She acknowledges his presence, but confirms his irrelevance to the continuing narrative of the environment. Her parting glance, if one is offered, is devoid of pity or judgment, carrying only the weight of inevitability. This final act underlines the film's core argument. Some truths are protected not by locks or sentinels, but by the very nature of their incomprehensibility to the unprepared mind. The symbolic weight of the crown is finally lifted by its total absence. The resolution is the quiet understanding that the object itself was less significant than the obsessive drive it provoked. The lead actor's final moments, often filmed in extreme close-up focused solely on the texture of his skin or the dilation of his pupils, present a portrait of someone who has been entirely stripped down to instinct, yet remains paralyzed by the cognitive scaffolding he cannot shed. His prior celebrated roles as individuals who achieved ultimate control through rigorous self-discipline only serve to highlight the devastating totality of his current surrender to chaos. Mahkota Tersembunyi concludes by returning to the landscape in its untouched state, framed by the same expansive, indifferent wide shots used near the beginning. The brief intrusion of human ambition, the footprints, the disturbed earth, the scattered remnants of technology, seem already to be receding, absorbed back into the endless green. The enduring emotion is not fear, but a profound melancholy born from witnessing a meticulous mind willingly dismantle itself upon encountering a reality it was not equipped, nor perhaps entitled, to fully grasp. The film suggests that the deepest secrets remain hidden precisely because they demand a fundamental reordering of the seeker's soul, a price few are ever truly willing or able to pay. The film's deliberate withholding of a conventional catharsis is perhaps its most challenging artistic choice, forcing the viewer into a state of prolonged ethical ambiguity regarding the protagonist's fate. The lack of closure acts as a persistent irritant, preventing the audience from neatly filing the experience away as a concluded narrative arc. This unresolved tension echoes the themes found in certain works of existential cinema, where the journey's meaning lies entirely in the process of disorientation, not in any discovered destination. The protagonist, having sacrificed his empirical self for a glimpse behind the veil, is left suspended in a state of perpetual becoming, neither fully integrated into the ancient world nor capable of returning to the modern one. The guide, in her final implied departure, represents the unwavering connection to authenticity. Her silence in the face of the protagonist's collapse is not a moral failing, but an acknowledgement that his struggle is now entirely internal, and thus beyond her capacity to influence or save. Her career, marked by roles requiring immense personal sacrifice for the sake of cultural preservation, informs this crucial lack of interference. She understands that some lessons must be learned in solitude, even if the tuition is sanity itself. The visual separation between them in the final scenes is telling. She moves through the dense foliage with an inherent grace, her form momentarily illuminated by a shaft of sunlight, while the protagonist remains trapped in the deeper shadows, literally and metaphorically obscured by the darkness of his own making. The ambient score, minimal throughout, contributes heavily to this sense of lingering uncertainty. When music is employed, it is typically high-pitched, dissonant string work that seems to vibrate just beyond the threshold of comfortable hearing, mimicking tinnitus or the high-frequency hum associated with deep unease. This auditory landscape rejects traditional melodic comfort, serving instead as a constant sonic reminder of the psychological pressure cooker the protagonist inhabits. The sound engineers have clearly aimed for a recording that feels less like a soundtrack and more like an actual, unpleasant resonance, emanating from the deepest parts of the jungle itself. Furthermore, the film subtly suggests that the very act of observing changes the observed, to such an extent that the original subject becomes unknowable. The protagonist arrived seeking the crown, an artifact of history or power, but through his relentless scrutiny, he succeeded only in creating a new, unstable artifact, himself, transformed by the gaze of the unknown. His final vacant expression is not one of defeat, but of an altered consciousness that has been rendered functionally obsolete by the very reality it sought to conquer. Mahkota Tersembunyi stands as a chilling testament to the limitations of structured knowledge when confronted with the vast, uncatalogued complexity of the world, leaving the viewer with the uneasy feeling that the greatest treasures are often guarded by their very inaccessibility to the modern calculating mind. The enduring power of Mahkota Tersembunyi lies in its masterful refusal to offer psychological closure through resolution. The film posits that some realities are inherently resistant to the analytical framework imposed by outsiders, a concept deeply embedded in the protagonist's biography as an academic known for mastering complex, yet ultimately finite systems. His inability to adapt stems from a career built on imposing order. When that order dissolves in the face of the jungle's organic, non-linear truth, he has no fallback mechanism. The few instances where the actor allows genuine, unscripted-seeming terror to break through his facade, a sharp gasp mistaken for a scream, a sudden, involuntary scramble backward, feel like vital signifiers of a system crashing beyond the point of reboot. The visual symbolism related to concealment and revelation is meticulously layered. The concept of the crown is never tied to a single visual object. Instead, the viewer is bombarded with images that could be the crown, a naturally occurring formation of crystalline rock, the shape of a broken archway catching the light, or even the elaborate crown woven into the hair of a barely visible extra during a village ceremony. This proliferation of potential signifiers ensures that the search remains perpetual. The director favors compositions where the central point of interest is always partially obscured by shadow or foreground elements, forcing the viewer's eye to strain, mimicking the protagonist's own frustrated attempts to focus his vision and intellect. The relationship between the two leads can be analyzed as a microcosm of cultural misunderstanding, persisting even in moments of shared peril. The guide perceives danger as a relational entity, something to be respected, circumvented, or integrated, whereas the protagonist perceives danger as an external problem to be solved or eliminated using defined metrics. When the protagonist finally collapses, physically unable to continue the arduous journey, the guide's reaction is not one of sorrow, but of environmental acceptance. Her quiet decision to leave him to his fate within the deep woods is the film's most brutal yet honest moment, asserting that survival is predicated on understanding and adhering to the local laws the protagonist fundamentally rejected until his body physically gave out. Ultimately, the film functions as a critique of the hubris inherent in documentation. The protagonist arrived to capture, label, and exhibit, believing ownership of the data equated to possession of the truth. Mahkota Tersembunyi argues that some truths are self-preserving precisely because they defy capture. The legacy of the film is its successful creation of an atmosphere so thick with suggestion and uncertainty that the viewer leaves feeling intellectually unsatisfied yet emotionally saturated. The film does not offer answers about the crown. It offers a devastatingly effective demonstration of why some seekers deserve to be swallowed by the mystery they pursue. The lingering resonance of Mahkota Tersembunyi is found in the film's sustained commitment to portraying sensory overload as psychological atrophy. The jungle, initially a challenge to be mapped, transforms into an active participant in the protagonist's breakdown, utilizing its vastness not for awe, but for annihilation of focus. The sheer density of the soundscape, the relentless chirping overlaid with the protagonist's ragged breath, and the amplified crunch of his own boots on damp earth, reaches a critical mass where the brain, unable to prioritize stimuli, begins to filter reality into chaotic static. This is where the lead actor's commitment to interiority truly shines. His eyes, frequently shot in unflattering, close-up detail, convey a man drowning in data, his pupils darting not in search of an object, but in a desperate, futile attempt to assign meaning to every incoming signal. The guide's presence becomes increasingly spectral as the protagonist descends further into sensory chaos. She moves not against the environment, but with it, seemingly oblivious to the auditory assault that cripples him. Her movements are economical, almost liquid, an antithesis to the protagonist's jerky, over-caffeinated attempts at navigation. This contrast highlights the theme that true immersion requires shedding the need for control. Her occasional physical presence near him in these final phases often serves to ground a specific, immediate threat: a venomous snake near his foot, a rotten branch above his head, demonstrating that her intuitive knowledge is pragmatic and life-preserving, while his intellectual quest is self-destructive. She is focused on the immediate now. He is trapped between a documented past and an unreadable future. The narrative cleverly utilizes the motif of stagnation versus flow. The protagonist is constantly fighting the mud, the vines, and the general slipperiness of the terrain, symbolizing his resistance to yielding. Conversely, the guide flows over obstacles, embracing the inherent yielding nature of the ecosystem. In one particularly haunting sequence, the protagonist attempts to capture the image of a rare, bioluminescent fungus, fumbling with his camera while submerged up to his knees in stagnant black water. The resulting image is grainy and useless, but the water itself, the medium he curses, seems to absorb his frustration, leaving the fungus unharmed and glowing mockingly in the background. This scene crystallizes the film's thesis. The attempt to forcibly halt and document a living system results only in the contamination of the observer. The ultimate tragedy is intellectual vanity exposed. The hidden crown ceases to be a physical relic and becomes instead the ghost of the protagonist's untapped potential. The recognition that his entire life's methodology was predicated on a flawed premise. When he is finally alone, perhaps sitting motionless as the rain begins to fall, a gentle cleansing sound that offers no threat but demands complete stillness. His expression is not one of fear, but of utter, exhausted comprehension. He realizes he didn't fail to find the crown. He failed to understand that he was the only thing standing between himself and the tranquility of the jungle's non-demanding acceptance. The final shot, often a slow zoom out from his inert form, suggests that the jungle has merely folded him back into its complexity, another layer of rich, decomposing material, and that the real hidden crown was the acceptance of one's own necessary smallness. The film's aesthetic decision to maintain the high humidity as a constant visual and tactile presence serves as a metaphor for the inescapable nature of the protagonist's psychological entrapment. Sweat is not just sweat. It is the visible manifestation of the jungle's persistent refusal to acknowledge boundaries. It beads on his brow during moments of intense concentration, blurs the delicate calibration of his scientific instruments, and stains his once crisp attire into forms of sodden, shapeless resignation. The lead actor expertly utilizes this physical burden. The way he constantly wipes his glasses, only to have them immediately fog again, becomes a recurring gesture of Sisyphean futility, a man trying to maintain intellectual clarity in an environment designed to dissolve definition. This physical stickiness translates directly into the emotional timbre of his interactions with the guide. When she offers him water, the shared canteen becomes a charged object, a moment of forced intimacy where their antithetical relationships with the environment collide. He drinks quickly, mechanically, betraying his need, while she takes only small, measured sips, demonstrating an understanding of sustainable consumption. This subtle difference in gesture reveals the chasm between them. He consumes resources with the urgency of a man hoarding against a known depletion date, while she lives within a perceived infinity. Her minimal wardrobe, always slightly damp but clinging naturally to her form, contrasts sharply with his stiff, layered, and increasingly absurd-looking technical gear, which seems designed for an Arctic expedition rather than this suffocating equatorial heat. The narrative frames the guide's final separation not as a desertion, but as an act of ecological triage. She leaves him not out of malice, but because his continued erratic presence constitutes a threat to her own delicate balance with the immediate surroundings. There is a heartbreaking stillness in the scene of her departure. She doesn't run, nor does she offer a final pitying look. She simply becomes part of the background she understands so intimately. The actor playing the guide achieves a profound emotional weight through negative space. Her absence in the frame speaks louder than any dramatic monologue ever could, leaving the protagonist suddenly deafened by the silence where her subtle, grounding presence used to be. The final visual statement focuses intensely on the texture of decay. As the camera slowly pulls back from the protagonist's final resting place, perhaps near the moss-covered ruins he came to study, the emphasis shifts entirely to the resurgence of the organic. Roots are seen actively gripping and fracturing stone. Insects move with purpose over discarded items of high technology. The film suggests that the hidden crown was never an object to be found, but the very process of entropy, the one force that modern, structured man cannot conquer or document. The protagonist's analytical mind, built to categorize and control, becomes the ultimate fuel for the very mystery it sought to resolve, consumed by the relentless, indifferent churn of the ecosystem. The film ends leaving the audience with the cold realization that sometimes the most profound discovery is the final, irreversible erasure of the self. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Real Thread channel. Please consider subscribing and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Mahkota Tersembunyi. The air in the dilapidated studio was thick with the smell of dust and forgotten ambition. Here, Maya, a singer whose voice had once graced stadium stages, but now echoed only in the empty halls of her past glory, was trying to recapture a flicker of that old magic. Her career, a meteoric rise fueled by raw talent and a penchant for dramatic ballads, had stalled, leaving her adrift in the murky waters of musical obscurity. She carried the weight of past controversies and the relentless pressure of an industry that devours and discards talent with equal fervor. Across town, or perhaps just across the fragile line of fate, was Rizal, a former child actor who had navigated the treacherous waters of early fame only to find adulthood devoid of compelling roles. His face, once instantly recognizable, now sought anonymity in the shadows of theater workshops, clinging to the craft of acting with the desperation of a man trying to hold on to a rapidly receding memory. His inspiration, whispered through the echoes of classic cinema, demanded authenticity, something the commercial machine had long since purged from his life. Their paths converged unexpectedly during the production of a small independent film, Mahkota Tersembunyi, The Hidden Crown. The script itself was a labyrinth of metaphors about hidden identity and the price of fame, a subject both Maya and Rizal knew intimately, though from different sides of the spotlight. Maya, initially reluctant, saw in the role of the enigmatic muse a chance to sculpt something real, something that demanded vulnerability rather than the polished artifice the public demanded of her. She approached the character with the same intense dedication she once poured into writing her platinum-selling albums, digging into the emotional scars left by years under scrutiny. Her director, a known eccentric who favored method acting and prolonged silences, pushed her to the brink, forcing her to confront the silence that had replaced applause. Rizal, meanwhile, found in his role a struggling writer obsessed with uncovering a forgotten local legend, a mirror to his own search for meaning. He immersed himself in research, reading obscure historical texts, mirroring the dedication he once showed while studying classical theater techniques in London, before being lured back by lucrative, though artistically bankrupting, television roles. He admired the commitment Maya brought to the set, recognizing a shared understanding of performance as survival. As the filming progressed, the lines between the characters and the actors began to blur. The narrative of the film which involved two figures slowly realizing they were chasing the same elusive truth, began to manifest in their interactions. There was a tension born not just of script requirements, but of two souls recognizing a shared, unspoken history of professional burnout. The climax of the story, shot on a windswept, forgotten stretch of coastline, required a deep emotional surrender from both leads. For Maya, it meant singing a raw, unadorned melody that spoke directly to her public failures. For Rizal, it involved a silent, agonizing confrontation with his past self. In that moment, under the unforgiving gaze of the camera, they found an unexpected camaraderie. It wasn't romance that bloomed, but a profound respect for the willingness to stand exposed, stripped bare of the protective layers that celebrity demands. When the final cut was assembled, the film wasn't the grand spectacle producers had hoped for. It was intimate, haunting, and deeply personal. It became a quiet testament to the idea that the most significant crowns, the ones of self-acceptance and genuine artistic expression, are often the ones worn in secret, away from the blinding flashbulbs, hidden in plain sight within the work itself. Both Maya and Rizal walked away not with box office records, but with the quiet satisfaction of having finally told a truth that mattered to them, a truth far more resonant than any manufactured blockbuster could offer. The initial friction between Maya and Rizal on set was palpable, a nervous energy that mirrored the film's themes of guarded identities. Maya, used to the adulation of massive crowds, initially bristled at the director's insistence on grueling takes where emotional resonance trumped technical perfection. Her training, largely derived from powerhouse vocal coaches who emphasized projection and control, was inadequate for the quiet, almost whispered devastation the script demanded. She remembered the early days, the raw, almost painful sincerity of her first live performances in smoky clubs, a sincerity she felt she had bartered away for stadium anthems designed to sweep crowds off their feet. This role felt like an excavation, digging through layers of platinum records and carefully managed public appearances to find the original, flawed voice. Rizal approached the script not just as an actor, but as a scholar of lost narratives. His immersion into the historical context of the film's local legend was obsessive, bordering on monastic. He saw the film set as a refuge from the soul-crushing monotony of commercial television, where he had spent years portraying charming but utterly hollow figures, roles he took to keep the lights on after his initial burst of childhood fame faded, leaving him financially vulnerable and creatively starved. He remembered the critical praise for his early stage work, particularly a demanding interpretation of a classical anti-hero, and he channeled that same intellectual rigor into deciphering the subtle motivations of his character, the writer who sacrifices everything for a fleeting moment of recognized genius. The shared workload began to forge an unspoken language between them. There were late nights reviewing scene blocking, fueled by lukewarm coffee, where Maya would dissect the lyrical structure of the emotional beats, applying musical phrasing to dialogue delivery. Rizal, drawing on his background in physical theater, would offer suggestions on posture and movement, noticing how Maya habitually shielded her left side, a subconscious defense mechanism against intrusive photography that had plagued her career. Their conversations weren't about celebrity gossip or industry maneuvering. They were about craft, about the anatomy of a lie told convincingly on screen versus the difficult reality of telling one's own truth. One afternoon, during a sequence requiring them to navigate a maze of decaying archives, Maya confessed, almost incidentally, that the most difficult part of fame wasn't the criticism, but the incessant need to appear happy, even when drowning. Rizal didn't offer platitudes. He simply nodded, recalling a particularly vicious tabloid piece written about his solitary demeanor following his last major film, which had labeled him unapproachable. He understood that vulnerability, once showcased, becomes public property, and their shared vulnerability on set